welcome to episode 1.1 of Axiom. In part 1 of this 3-part series, we discover that there exist many natural mechanisms that create bias, and that the inability to perfectly process new and old information is an unavoidable human phenomenon. It's time to challenge our axioms. There's usually a negative connotation to imperfect rationality. The idea exists that the inability to perfectly process information is the conscious or purposeful mistake of the person or group of people in question, when, in reality, it's a perfectly natural and unavoidable human phenomenon. The inability to be perfectly rational actors is an inherent human trait rather than a personal shortcoming. In fact, the expectation for human beings to act as perfectly impervious rational machines is unrealistic. Human beings would simply be unable to function if the time and effort were taken to review all sides of contextual information regarding a given issue in order to arrive at a conclusion that could be considered the truth. Think about it this way. When you're driving on the highway, are you estimating the speed of all the vehicles around you, calculating the exact parameters of where to place your car to mitigate every risk, and computing the perfect route, speed, and trajectory to arrive at your destination without hitting any traffic and not getting hurt? Or are you simply believing and taking it as a truth that based on all your past experiences with driving, that everyone is going to follow the rules and that everything will be fine? Granted, this example is not exactly about our internal mechanisms, about our beliefs and arriving at the truth. Still, it illustrates how impossible it is for us to actually absorb and use all the information that's at our disposal to arrive at the most logical conclusion. We physically and mentally cannot do it. So our brains create a mechanism over time in which we constantly absorb all our surrounding information to make quick and calculated subjective inferences in the future. This mechanism is often referred to as implicit bias. Adrian Barden, professor and PhD holder in philosophy and author of The Truth About Denial, a book about bias and self-deception that I used a lot for my research, explains this as the general term for relatively unconscious and relatively automatic features of prejudice, judgment, and social behavior. Jonathan Bendor, professor of political science at Berkeley and author of Bounded Rationality in Politics, the book that launched my interest and research in this topic. Now, he states that these natural and unavoidable mechanisms support the theory of bounded rationality, which claims that errors and biases categorize all human decision-making. Now, today's episode is all about understanding what bounded rationality is. So let's do another example, but let's apply it to our socio-political realm. We have so much information at our disposal. Often, different information can contradict each other. And this may be a topic for another time, but there's different information because different platforms have different objectives with the information that they share. We won't get into that now, but what happens is, like while driving, instead of being able to observe and calculate all that different information and be able to compute somewhat of a truth, we simply continue to believe in the other drivers that have never let us down in the past. It is much easier to believe that your source of informational truth, whether it be your parents, your government, your preferred news source, or even a friend or a colleague, is providing us with everything we need to drive forward and arrive at our target destination. And once again, we wouldn't be able to survive or be productive with our lives otherwise. This example basically illustrates how bounded rationality affects us. Bounded rationality basically is an explanation of our limitations and helps us understand that the different things that unconsciously keep us from always arriving at the most rational final destination exist. Now, I'm going to start a little aparté here because it is important to note that the theory of bounded rationality is not political or even social in nature. Bounded rationality is at its core a behavioral economic theory. The idea of bounded rationality was first introduced by the interdisciplinary economist Herbert Simon in the late 20th century, not as a freely formed theory in itself, but as a response to the prevalent economic theory of rational choice. The economic theory of rational choice was created with the goal of being able to predict economic behavior, which depends on the fact that we are able to construct forecasts about economic data that contain no systematic error whatsoever. Herbert Simon affirms that contrary to the prevailing method of behavioral economic theory and the theory of rational choice, human beings are not cognitively able to always make the most ideal decisions. It refutes the microeconomic idea that presents human beings as miraculous machines. The theory concludes that some issues are vastly too complex for our mental capacity to arrive at rational conclusions. So, the question is not if a human being can arrive at fully rational conclusions, but rather how it is possible to work around their indisputable cognitive limitations. Simply being aware that we are plagued by such limitations is definitely the first step. While this originally emerged as an economic theory, political scientist Jonathan Bendor, in his book entitled Bounded Rationality in Politics, aims to connect the behavioral theory to the political realm. Bendor's work is revolutionary in this domain because it is the first attempt to apply the theory in this new context. Instead of relating these cognitive limitations to economics as a method to predict economic behavior, Bendor uses bounded rationality as a way to explain political behavior, thus giving the theory of bounded rationality a new and inherently social connotation. Now that we've established what bounded rationality is, its goal, and where it comes from, we can start exploring the meat of this theory. What exactly is it that limits our ability to be able to be perfectly rational in the socio-political part of our lives? The information on which we base our thoughts and decisions comes from many sources, most of which are beyond our control. Nonetheless, we can trace evidence of our occasional irrationality to certain common mechanisms and causes. Now, since the number of cognitive processes that affect our rationality are way too numerous and go beyond the scope of this series, I'm going to synthesize the relevant mechanisms in two categories, which I call the environmental cause and the motivational cause. Let's start with the environmental cause. The first prevalent constraint on our rationality is our environment. Bendor observes that there is always far more information in our objective environments than we can perceive or attend to. What he's saying is, similar to where we're driving, we're constantly being flooded with so much social data that our brains literally need to block it out and only focus on what we already know or perceive to be true at the time. It would simply be overwhelming otherwise. On top of that, at the very beginning, as you're going through the beginning stages of your life, this is when your initial beliefs are formed, often without even being aware. So we are somewhat at the mercy of our circumstances because it is these environments that build our initial biases. So we have two huge things already here from our environments. First, our initial views reflect what could have been around us when we came into the world. And then from that moment on, everything we encounter afterwards, constantly, is just too much. So we stick with what we've known since the very beginning. Not only do our environments create our initial biases and then present us with constant new and incoming information that our brains filter out on the daily, but as political scientist Robert Jervis notes, people interpret incoming information in terms of what is of concern to them at the time the information arrives. For example, if we live in an unsafe environment where bodily harm is a primary concern, one might first see the topic of immigration as a threat or propagator of such harm. On the other hand, if you live in a prosperous area where cultural diversity is prevalent, you may first see immigration as a contributor to such prosperity. I use the topic of immigration because that's what we'll be discussing in parts 2 and 3 of this series. But the same is true for other things as well. Let's go through another simplified example. Let's say you live in an area that has never or almost never been touched by a natural disaster such as a hurricane or an earthquake. Suddenly, all your social media becomes flooded with alerts about incoming storm season or seismic activity. Because that is not a concern to you and likely never has been or will be, you'll probably dismiss those alerts knowing you'll be safe and you have nothing to worry about, and you'll do absolutely nothing about it. However, if you are in an area that is known to be on the receiving end of these disasters, you'll probably see those alerts, and since that is something that is already of concern to you at the time the information arrives, it becomes extremely important and you'll start preparing accordingly. Now, let's think of someone somewhere in the middle. Perhaps you've either been struck by a natural disaster or are close to someone who has. Perhaps you know how devastating this can be, so you decide to see if there's any way you can help those who will be affected. Notice how these are 3 very different actions that are taken at the same point in time, being given the exact same information. The difference, the environment each person is in, and the concerns each person has at the time the information is received. This is obviously an oversimplification, and these different reactions probably seem normal and reasonable to most people. If you applied it to some social situations, objectively, you might notice it's not so different. This just illustrates how your environment and circumstance can greatly affect the thoughts you have and actions you take compared to someone in a different environment. But our environments affect us even more than that. Humans tend to hold on to the perceptions that they have learned from their environments because these perceptions have been built over time. This creates a resistance to new information as it may be seen as less reliable by our brains, for no other reason than the fact that we have spent less time with it. So just the fact that you and your family have been listening to a certain news source for the past 20 years is the factor that gives this news source credibility in your brain, unconsciously. Now, why does that happen? Well, it's a shortcut to allow us to process and sort new information without needing to pursue a comprehensive analysis of each new piece of information that we encounter. If you think about it and you remember my driving example, we wouldn't really be able to function if these things didn't happen automatically. Is it potentially problematic? Yes. Is it natural and necessary? Also, yes. And this is absolutely a vicious cycle that reinforces itself with time because it creates habit, which Bender claims permits similar stimuli or situations to be met with similar responses or reactions, without the need for a conscious rethinking of the decision to bring about the proper action. And so, once our brain files a certain type of information as new and less reliable than what we already know, it will be that much more inclined to do so with any similar information going forward. The simplest way to put it is, that's what we're used to, and that's all it takes. Let's move on to the second factor, the motivational cause. A second prevalent constraint on our rationality is our motivated cognition, which can be defined as the retroactive invention of justification or the initial processing of information to fulfill a certain pre-existing belief. I'm going to go into details and research, but the clearest way to explain this is we hate to be wrong. It's uncomfortable for us to be wrong. So we do everything we can to feel like we're right, that all our actions are right, and that it has always been the case. It is important here to add that this is another unconscious mechanism that may be characterized as defensive, because motivated cognition defends perception with the subconscious desired goal of maintaining a comfortable status quo. As humans, we find comfort in what we already know, but also what we already perceive to be true. Another way to view this constraint on our rationality is the mechanism of denial, which is highly related to the concept of cognitive dissonance. According to Barden, cognitive dissonance is the state of mind one experiences when one encounters information that is inconsistent with one's beliefs. Simply put, it's uncomfortable, even if the information may be true. This phenomenon can be extremely mentally disruptive and will often lead to denial because we do not want to experience this discomfort. Barden explains how denial is evoked in the face of new information. It can occur when a person wants their world to remain a certain way. A desire to avoid feelings of insecurity or loss of control, or a desire to defend one's cultural or political identity, or simply one's self. Being able to admit, hey, I've done this a certain way for a long time, or I believed this for a long time, and maybe there's something I'm missing, is actually very challenging. And I'm willing to bet that while listening to my explanation of this mechanism of denial, most of you were thinking about the people on the opposite end of the political spectrum saying, oh man, they really need to listen to this. And so it's important to remember that our thoughts, opinions, and biases are often at the mercy of our environments. And to make matters more complicated, once we absorb this information from our environments, we succumb to our natural cognitive processes that aim to facilitate any information processing that may occur in the future. Unfortunately, this means that we do favor our pre-existing opinions, which form biases, and new information has many hurdles to overcome before it can be thoughtfully considered. This process of bounded rationality will thus greatly affect exposure to new people and cultures, as we will explore in the following episodes. I want to close this episode with a fun fact. And today's fun fact is about one of my biggest role models, Socrates. Remember how I said that we would not be able to function and live productive lives without these kinds of harmful shortcuts our minds take to facilitate all the thinking we'd have to do? Well, many ancient philosophers whose job and life goal was basically to try and do that, to think of everything, address every question, and somehow arrive at the truth by objectively considering information, often literally did nothing else with their lives. In fact, Socrates, one of the greatest ancient philosophers to have ever existed, was known to not even take the time to eat and clean himself, and instead spent every waking hour trying to consider every piece of information from every single person who would talk to him that he possibly could. Actually succeeding at doing everything I've mentioned in today's episode would definitely be a full-time job. I hope today's episode opened your eyes to our bounded rationality and why I've decided to start this project. In the description for each episode, there's a link that lets you leave me voice messages. If you have more to add or another opinion to share, I'd love to hear it. I might even share it in an upcoming episode. Thank you so much for listening, and until next time.